I have an old grinding wheel that was part of my dad's stuff. So this is probably 1920s vintage. It's in pretty terrible shape, a lot of parts missing, and this is what I'm going to try to make out of it. I want to get the frame back in condition using the old wood for the fun of it, and hook up a treadle pedal. And so this is kind of the finished product that I'm after in this little project. The frame is in fairly decent shape. This leg was split out and leaning at a pretty tough angle. So it was very low tech. The axle just literally was in a metal bracket like this and just rubbing on the wood. So it's kind of stiff to turn. So I just started pulling things apart, pulling nails out. You can tell how old this was, and that the 2x material that it was made out of was really 2x. And I just started ripping it apart, pulling nails out, trying to salvage the frame, but I'm going to redo where the moving parts are with bearings. So I pulled the bad leg off, glued it up, and put it back on the thing. As far as the moving parts, it's a wheel. It's got a pipe down the center and a pipe handle and an interesting threaded rod that goes through the center, and a piece of square wood that go into a square hole in the middle of the stone. You can see how this comes apart. That part literally threads on, and the axle is about 7/8 of an inch in diameter. Pretty rusty, pretty rough. But as I pulled it apart to see what I needed to do to rebuild it, the stone itself is in tough shape on the side that you can't see in this image. And on the front side here, it's fairly flat. On the other side, it's kind of rough. And I've come up with a plan to get that to turn in more of a level way. There's also a wooden center that is split. It was split into 3 pieces, and the whole has been just kind of reamed out, I think, through the ages of turning on this axle. Sometimes the axle would turn, sometimes just the wheel would turn. And you can see that it was split there, and so I'm going to rebuild that part. You'll see in a moment how I did that. I'm just using the axle here to kind of pound it out. It was a relatively tight fit. Interestingly enough, that the square hole in the center of this grinding wheel isn't in the center. And so the hole in the piece of wood is off center, and you'll see as I rebuild it, I just use calipers like a compass to find the true center of the stone when I make the new wooden center. So these are sort of the parts kind of laid out in front of you here as I started pulling this thing apart, sorting through what was going to be usable and what was not going to be usable, what I had to rebuild, what I had to make from scratch, etc., to get this wheel to turn in a fairly easy manner. And I was going to have it turn on bearings rather than just wood on metal. And you'll see the solution I come up with here in just a moment. Again, I'm kind of just perusing this centerpiece, and I'm planning on rebuilding that out of another piece of wood. So here I am taking that center that came out of it. I've found a block of wood in my scrap pile that I was able to machine down to the square shape, and so this square piece of wood fits tightly into the square hole in the wheel. Again, the problem is that the square hole is not in the center of the wheel. And so as I take this block of wood over to the table saw, I just trued up one side, one cut of it to get a true 90-degree cut on that block. Then I measure the block for the width of the wheel, the length of the block, the width of the wheel, and just mark that, put it in my table saw again, and cut the block to the length of the block that was on the original wheel. Here I've put my block now into the center of the wheel, and I'm going to use calipers to find the true center by just basically by holding the calipers out at the perimeter of the wheel and measuring to the center in a few spots until I kind of triangulate on the center. The block is sitting fairly flat and level with the flatter side of the wheel, and in a moment you'll get the idea of the flat side versus the not so flat side and see my solution, which is probably not very elegant, but it definitely does the job. So here I've just got some dividers, and I'm going to just measure around the perimeter of this wheel, making some marks, and just slowly, by kind of triangulating on that block, finding where I think the center of the wheel will actually be. Then I'm going to take that block, drill it out. I did that on the drill press with a Forstner bit, beveled out that area where that metal ring rides. And now here I bought some bearings that were 7/8 inside diameter, but this rod was so pitted and rusted that I have clamped it here in a pretty dorky manner in my lathe. I've got one side in a piece of wood with a hole drilled in it, and the other side in my lathe chuck. And I've smoothed it down to fit into the size of these bearings that I purchased. And you saw a picture there of the bearing. Here I've actually placed the bearing now loosely in a couple pieces of wood just to see, once I had this wheel on bearings rather than just metal on wood, would it turn nicely and would it turn freely? So I just cut a piece of wood, drilled a hole in it, stuck the bearings in there, and gave it a try. And you can see, because the wheel is so heavy, you've got inertia working for you. And once you get it spinning, I think it's going to work really well with a treadle, because the wheel wants to keep turning due to the heavy weight and the inertia. That square block of wood that's turning with the wheel now, I'm going to end up turning a round block that will ride evenly on the side of the wheel to hold the wheel 90 degrees with the axle. So here's one of the bearings, and I'll show you what I did to build some little brackets to hold those. I used a circle cutter to cut out the diameter of the front side of the bearing, the deep side of the bearing, and then a circle cutter at another adjustment to cut the back side of the bearing. And you'll see here in a moment some little carriers that I've made out of wood to support the two bearings, left and right, of this wheel. Again, you can see with bearings, the wheel works very smoothly. Here's the idea. Again, just by putting a little recess, I make these two little bearing keepers. Here's the rough wood. There's the bearing. There's the circle cutter. Again, I just adjust the circle cutter to meet the diameter of the bearing, cut that circle, put half the bearing in there, cut a wider circle for the flanged part of that bearing, and then capture the bearing inside the two pieces of the wood. And by doing that, it makes a very nice bearing keeper. It's encased in the wood. It'll be easily screwed down to the frame of the sawhorse shaped stand and work pretty nicely. So basically what I'm doing now is just preparing the wood to make space for these bearings. So I'm just, I put the bearing inside, glue the faces of the wood together. I'm just making, obviously they're rough cut so far. I'm going to shape them a little nicer here in a moment, but I just get the two halves together, spread the glue, clamp these up, and then later I will shape them just using a jigsaw and rasps and oscillating spindle sander, and get those to look halfway decent as little bearing keepers. But for now I'm just gluing them up to encase each of those bearings in the wood. Now, as far as the uneven side of the grinding wheel, I wanted to turn a plate that would bear against the wheel. So I've decided to just turn this out of wood, and you can see I've recessed this side so it'll just bear on the wheel out at its perimeter where the wheel is flatter. And you'll see when this is mounted up, it kind of makes sense to hold the wheel at its flat portion in order to get the wheel to rotate evenly and at 90 degrees with the axle. So here I am on the lathe. I just took some scrap wood, honestly, glued it up flat, glued another piece on the back side of it sticking out so I could get a little bit of a wider bearing surface on the axle. And I just rough turned this down, measured the space I had in between the two bearings in order to fill that space up with the wood and the bolt that holds that axle together. And so after I had turned the face of this dish-shaped wooden piece and recessed that a little bit, I'm just using my parting tool here to cut the width of it, again, sized to fit in between the two bearings so that the wheel will not wiggle left and right. And now I'm just cleaning it up to make it look a little bit nicer, rounding the edges to take the roughness out of it, make it a little smoother looking, but I'm certainly not going to great lengths to make it beautiful. I'm just making it a functional piece in order to hold the grinding wheel at 90 degrees with the axle. That's really all this piece is going to do. And so I shaped it as best I could, took some sandpaper to it to take the rough edges off of it. Again, not pretty, doesn't have any finish on it, it's just a functional piece. I get it sanded to a pretty decent finished product, taking a little bit more off that surface, and then I, using the lathe and a 7/8 Forstner bit, I drill the hole down the center of it. That will fit fairly tightly on the axle of the grinding wheel, and as I tighten up that bolt that is part of the axle, the nut that is part of the axle, it will suck this dish-shaped wooden thing up against the side of the stone to hold it at 90 degrees with the axle. Hope that makes sense. You see the finished product looks like that. Not beautiful, but definitely functional. So here's the stand, all the parts just kind of laying around, and I'm about to slowly reassemble this to get it into some kind of functional shape. And I wanted these two things to be obviously at 90 degrees with the stand. I want the wheel to be centered front and back, so I marked that with a square to get these even left and right. Drilled some holes in my little bearing keepers. You can see these have already been shaped now. I used a Forstner bit to sink the heads of the screws in, and you can see now mounted on the bearings in my new bearing keepers, the wheel turns very freely way better than it used to when it was just metal on wood. And I'm closing in on the finished product as far as sort of, we could call this phase one, as I line that up, get it 90 degrees with the frame, and screw those down for the final time. I try to get the wheel to turn, I would say, parallel with the stand or at 90 degrees with the axle. Here I've hooked a coat hanger to it just to get the idea of a treadle. And so that I'm going to do a part 2 as I create this treadle, and it might be something as simple as a coat hanger, but here's the wheel spinning freely using a treadle. And stay tuned for part 2. Hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please subscribe, and thank you for watching.